Are you struggling to come up with original content week in and week out? Start a podcast. Interview your ideal clients, let them talk about what they care about most, and never run out of content ideas again. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. Welcome back to B2B Growth. My name is James Carberry. I'm one of the co-hosts of this show, and we are joined today by Garrick Chow. He is the senior staff author at LinkedIn Learning. Garrick, how you doing today, man?
Doing great, James. Thanks.
I'm really excited to chat with you. We've been going back and forth on LinkedIn the last couple of months, and really excited to have you share with our listeners some of the planning components that go into podcasting. But before we do that, Garrick, can you give listeners just a little bit of context? What is your role at LinkedIn Learning these days? And then tell us a little bit of your podcasting background.
Sure thing. Yeah. Well, I'm a longtime author, is what we call this position at LinkedIn Learning. We were formerly lynda.com. We were acquired by LinkedIn in 2015. They basically acquired our entire library and our entire staff of authors and our content creators. But probably, like 10 years ago at this point, I started the lynda.com podcast, which was a video training podcast at the time where we would sort of highlight our new courses of the week or anything that our viewers might find interesting that we could direct them to. Sort of like a marketing podcast, but also providing a lot of informative content and things like that.
Love it.
You remember back in the days when there were more video podcasts?
Yep, exactly.
I kind of miss those, but yeah, it was basically me, in front of a camera, like teleprompter, and just talking about our content. And then we would cut away to, some of our course highlights and things. But we would also, do on-site interviews at conferences and things like that. So, but it was basically me and just one other person, recording the content, editing it, uploading the RSS feed and stuff like that.
Got it. And I've noticed that a lot of the content, just as I was doing some research on you, you've produced a lot of content around kind of the art of podcasting on the LinkedIn Learning platform. So if you're searching anything related to podcasting on LinkedIn Learning, you're probably going to see Garrick's name pop up quite a bit. So again, which is why, the reason I reached out, Garrick, because I think you've got a lot of value to add here. As we were going back and forth on kind of what specific topic we wanted to dive into, we both kind of thought that the planning component of podcasting would be interesting for our listeners, folks that are considering starting a podcast for their B2B brand. Mm-hmm. And as we dove into that a little bit, there were three specific things around planning that we both thought would be really interesting. The first one is around developing the scope and the format of the podcast. Could you elaborate on kind of what that looked like for you and while you were doing your show for Lynda, but also some of the consulting that you do with other companies around this stuff? Mm-hmm. Really curious to hear your thoughts on scope and format.
Yep. I would say that even before, diving into the scope, I think what I usually start off with when I talk to people about who are interested in setting up their podcasts is, I always start with the why. Like, why do you want to set up your podcast? What is, do you actually have something you're passionate about that you want to spend time talking about? Are you trying to solve a particular problem by putting your podcast out there? I do run into, people who are like, I think they just like hearing the sound of their own voice and just want to start talking into a microphone, which, I'm sure, their families would subscribe to maybe. Like, if you're trying to, market something or trying to solve a problem, it's sort of finding, what are you passionate about? And, the passion it doesn't necessarily just have to be, what do you really like, but it can also be like what really annoys you, and that could lead into what problems are you trying to fix. And from there, I would say once you sort of have that nailed down, then you can start thinking about the scope of your podcast. Like I try to tell people not to be so general because there's so many podcasts out there on pretty much, any topic you can think of. So, don't just do a podcast on parenting, do a podcast on, parenting while traveling or, large family parenting or something like that, something specific that you can really sort of carve your niche into.
Yep. Homeschool parenting in Wisconsin.
Yeah, exactly.
The more niche you can get, the better. It's a big reason why we've started doing little sub series within B2B growth, because B2B marketing is such a widely covered topic that doing series like how to podcast and content-based networking and different series that we've started doing, that we've got a series now on category creation. And so I'm very bullish on that exact same thing, Garrick. So I'm glad you brought that up.
And it makes sense because, the general topics might get you maybe a slightly larger audience at first, but when you hone in on a specific topic, then you really are like speaking to very, specific people and their passions. Yep. And they'll this podcast is talking directly to me. It's not just this buffet of content. It's a very specific topic that I'm very interested in.
Exactly. And so once folks have kind of honed in on, what is the niche that they're going to focus on, what are your thoughts around format? Do you err on the side of kind of interview-based shows, or what shapes the advice that you give to folks around format?
I guess, it depends on, the interview is always nice because I think it's nice to have somebody else to talk to there. Even radio shows, they have like a co-host or something like that, just so you can have a conversation going. Because I think the real appeal of these podcasts is the ability to have these long form interviews that aren't just sound bites where somebody's trying to get, their main talking points out before you cut the commercial. Mm-hmm. So being able to interview somebody, also interested in your field or related to your field and being able to have that back and forth conversation, I think is a great thing to have. And I don't think it's that difficult to find people to talk to. Now, the ability to interview people is a different thing, but I think it's much more interesting to listen to a conversation than a long form monologue in most cases.
Yeah, there are some podcasts. I listen to a podcast called the Craig Groeschel Leadership Podcast, and he puts in an enormous amount of prep work into preparing his kind of 30-minute episodes that he does like once or twice a month. And because of his preparedness going into those episodes, he's got very well-defined talking points, and there ends up being a ton of value that I extrapolate from each of those episodes. But I mean, I think he's even said that he puts in 20 to 25 hours of prep to be able to do a 30-minute podcast episode.
Yeah.
And so that's just something that most people aren't going to make the time to put in that much work.
And you can really tell when somebody is really speaking from having done a lot of research and really looking into a topic rather than just sort of, talking off the top of their head.
Off the top of their head. Yep. Yeah. Which is a trap I myself even find myself getting into a lot. And so I'm trying to hone in on doing, just being more methodical in terms of with the solo episodes that we do. Not that I think the majority of our episodes are interview-based episodes, but we found that some people do enjoy the solo stuff because of just the content tends to be different, and they hear a little bit more of kind of the behind the scenes of the host. And when folks, or at least in our context, folks love hearing kind of that behind the scenes type content. And so I feel like this is said all the time, but it depends on your audience and who you're talking to for what their preferences are going to be. And the best way to know that is to intimately know your audience. And that's going to shape a lot of this stuff.
All right. Today's growth story is about search engine marketing. Clear Company is an HR tech company that was doing a lot of things right. Their messaging was clear. Their product produced incredible results. But they were struggling to drive qualified traffic to their website. Then they found Directive Consulting, a B2B search marketing agency. Within the first 12 months of working with Directive, Clear Company was able to increase their qualified lead volume by 157%. I have a hunch that Directive can get these kind of results for you too. So head over to directiveconsulting.com and request a totally free custom proposal. That's directiveconsulting.com. All right, let's get back to this interview.
The next thing that I want to talk to you about, Garrick, is scripting versus outlining. Is it an either or? Is it a combo of both? How do you think about scripting and outlining?
I think that directly relates to what we were just talking about as far as, being able to talk off the top of your head versus interviewing somebody versus doing your research and things like that. I generally recommend at least an outline. A lot of the people that I work with, they're on the circuit speaking at conferences and things like that, and they know their material, cold. So if it's something like that, they can usually, talk off the top of their head. But I generally say, well, at least outline your intro, your talking points, and have your outro written out as well, or maybe even completely write out your intro and outro and then just have your talking points and go from there. It really depends on sort of how comfortable you are just speaking in front of the microphone with, nobody in particular to be looking at or talking to. Mm-hmm. I do find that the people who speak at conferences tend to know a little bit better in terms of being able to anticipate the questions that arise from the things they say. Because I think a lot of that, especially when you're talking solo, is being able to say, okay, well, I've just made this statement. That's going to make this question pop up in their head. So I better address that right away. Yeah. So it's just sort of having that in your head, being able to anticipate those sort of questions that nobody's actually there to ask at that time.
Yeah. There's one particular show. It's a podcast that Mike Rowe does. And I'm blanking on the name of it. If you search Mike Rowe in the podcast app, it's one of my, I haven't listened to it in probably a few weeks now, but he writes, it's fully scripted episodes. He says that he writes them on planes, but they're these little short stories that he writes. And it's a lot of times it's about some famous character or a famous person from history. And he's telling like an unknown component or story of from their life that you wouldn't otherwise know. And then at the end of the story, you find out like, holy cow, he was talking about Abe Lincoln this entire time. Yeah. Like I had no clue. And so that's one example of like fully scripting an interview where it's just really, really well done. I think he's got probably I think it's a top 100 podcast in iTunes. He's got a raving fan base of folks that love that content. But then there are other folks that even with this interview, we don't have a hard script for this. We've got I know how I'm going to intro the episodes and I have a good idea of how I'm going to close it out just because I've done hundreds of them. But for the most part, we just had an outline coming into it. So I agree that you can go either way on this, but I err on the side of outlining more than scripting. Scripting to me, just the way Mike Rowe does it, it's an incredibly quality product. I just know myself enough to know I'm not going to put in the time to fully script something like that, like a narrative style episode.
It's definitely a different skill too. With outlining, you can glance down and see, okay, next I want to ask about this question, this topic or whatever. But with scripting, you've got to be very careful, first of all, to be able to write the way you speak. Yeah. You don't want to sound like you're reading, or, you don't want to hear pages flipping as you're going through your script. But, some people who script like to be very deliberate with their word choices. And, even for like the courses that I do, for LinkedIn now, I script out a lot of my things and I find it's very useful to do that because I want to make sure that I don't want to get 3 minutes into my script and realize I should have said something, in the first minute that I was supposed to tie into. So I like having everything sort of laid out that way, but it really is a different skill being able to script and read it.
Yep, absolutely. This last component of planning, Garrick, that we're going to talk about is around kind of the research that you do with the folks that you're interviewing. What are some of the big things that you find yourself teaching or coaching folks whenever you're working with people around this component of podcast planning?
As far as like interviewing your subjects and things like that? Yep. I think just, obviously get to know them. I wouldn't say, cyber stalk them or anything like that, but, everybody has info out there, especially if, they're out there sharing their own info. I'm sure they've got, their LinkedIn page or their Facebook page or blog post that they've done. A good, like you and I, we exchanged a couple emails back and forth just to establish the scope of what we were going to talk about today, and just sort of understand the areas that we're going to cover and things like that. So it's just sort of good to know going in what you're going to be talking about and having a little bit of a pre-interview too, just, to have a short conversation before you actually hit the record button.
Yep. And those don't have to be long. We did it for 5 minutes before we hit record. So they don't need to be long and exhaustive, but just making sure that you and your guest are on the same page so that nothing, they're not caught off guard and they're, oh, wow, I didn't know that we were going to
and comfortable.
Be talking about that. Yeah, exactly.
Some people are, very used to talking in front of a mic. Other people, they might not be in this sort of industry where they spend a lot of time being interviewed. So taking a little bit more time to talk to them beforehand and just putting them at ease and maybe even helping them, make sure that they have their mic adjusted properly if you're doing it remotely and things like that can just put people a lot more at ease. Exactly. So it's not just about sort of warming up yourself and your voice, but it's warming up that that interaction between you and your guest too.
Yep. And one of the things that we've recently started doing for ourselves, and we've started doing this for a lot of our customers, is figuring out to find the right guests based on the topics that we know that our listeners are going to want to consume. Mm-hmm. We will go out and actually we'll find LinkedIn articles that have been written around a particular topic, or blog posts that have been written around a topic, or we'll find folks that were featured in a, top 100 fastest growing companies list or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And so when you're proactively finding guests that align with the narrative of the content that you're trying to communicate in your show, it gives you a stepping off point to say, hey, like similar to you, Garrick. So seeing that you developed a lot of kind of content around podcasting in the LinkedIn Learning platform, it was an easy thing for me to approach and say, hey, I see that you've done a lot of this stuff. Is there one particular lesson or kind of theme that you'd love to cover? And so kind of reverse engineering your audience that way to actually help you find guests that already have content because they've written about it publicly, I think makes the guest prospecting process so much easier.
And I really like that idea of sort of being proactive and going out and finding, like maybe coming up with a wish list of people you'd like to talk to, reaching out early. Maybe the interview is not going to happen for another month or two, but in the meantime, you can still be reading what they're writing on their blog or posting on their pages and sort of getting to know them along that period of time. So you're not just, hey, want to have an interview tomorrow and having to do all your research,
exactly.
in 24 hours. So it makes for a much better experience for, pretty much everybody from the creators to the listeners at that point.
Totally agree. Garrick, if there's somebody listening, they want to stay connected with you. I know you've created an enormous amount of content on the LinkedIn Learning platform. How else can folks dig into more of what you're about, learn more about you, and ultimately stay connected with you?
They can find me at linkedin.com. Just search for Garrick Chow. You'll find me at, if you go to linkedin.com/learning for our LinkedIn Learning, you'll find me there. I have a page at lynda.com/Garrick Chow. Occasionally tweet, not too much these days, but you can find me all kinds of ways. Just look for me and you'll find me. There's not too many Garrick Chows out there.
Wonderful. Garrick, well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure.
Digital marketing agencies have a tough job. You have to stay on top of the latest marketing strategies for your clients and your agency. What if there was a way you could address both at the same time? Imagine your agency putting out content with greater quality and quantity. Envision bringing your clients a turnkey solution for one of B2B marketing's fastest growing media strategies, podcasting. All those clients asking for your help with their account-based marketing efforts? Picture being the first to bring them the idea of content-based networking, showing them the proven strategy for breaking into their most coveted accounts. Here's the concept. Sweetfish Media is looking to work with a limited number of innovative agencies interested in a new partnership model. We produce a podcast for your agency. You introduce the power of podcasting and Sweetfish services to your clients. Everybody wins. Learn more at sweetfishpartners.com.